everybody. Sit in comfy and have a lovely cup of tea to listen to this marvellous tale of research and conversation that Duncan is going to share with us. I've seen this project evolve over the course of the last year, and those that have been involved in the various conversations, the interviews, and the in-depth research that Andrew led, some in our online survey and some in individual interviews. And it's really built the narrative of quite exactly how much housing associations are doing that really does underpin the infrastructure of the economy. This project builds on quite the role housing plays as infrastructure, but this specific piece of work shows really in depth how housing associations really are critical infrastructure that we need to value and cherish. To give us an overview of the conclusions, we're going to have Professor Duncan Maclennan, and after we hear from Duncan, we'll have reflections from Richard Meade, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. And after Richard, we're followed by Bryony Willet from the Home Group and Nile Istephan from Eildon Group. And we'll finish the live stream at 11:15. For those of you joining us in person, we'll continue the conversation upstairs over refreshments. So although I think Duncan needs no introduction, just in case there is anyone in the room that doesn't know who he is, he was awarded a CPE for services to UK housing research in 1997, the year I finished my degree, I should probably say. Sorry, Duncan. He remains affiliated to the University of Glasgow as an emeritus professor of urban economics and holds professorial... to 1999, and then spent a decade working in government as special advisor to the First Minister of Scotland and as chief economist in the government of Victoria, and then as chief economist in Canada's Federal Department for Infrastructure and Cities. He acted as an advisor to ministers in the UK, Scotland, France, Poland, Norway, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Academy of Social Sciences, and an honorary member of the Royal Town Planning Institute, the Chartered Institute of Housing, and the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. Duncan is truly a one-off, and when he could work anywhere in the world, we are very lucky he's chosen to spend his time and expertise working here in Scotland. So, over to you, Duncan.
There are some people in this room that have been suffering from listening to me in university classes since the early 1980s. So those are very familiar faces. John Boyle, amongst others. Hello. For those of you that haven't had the experience before, I hope you'll wait till the end of the presentation. I have some form in this area of talking about the wider effects of housing associations on the economy. In fact, on the 17th of December 1997, I actually launched the Scottish Homes Board paper on the wider effects of housing associations, and they introduced a small programme of support. They didn't take it any further because they were warned off doing so by the Scottish office at the time, because it was felt it was treading into the area of Scottish enterprise and local enterprise companies. In other words, government worked together as well. Government worked together as well then as they had done until quite recently. I was reminded of the importance and the long-standing knowledge that there is, I think, both in the policy community, amongst yourselves, and even into the financial community, that you have these wider effects. I was reminded of this, and I'll get to the story, since this is storytelling. I'm telling a wee bit at the beginning of the story. I went into Waterson's yesterday to buy a copy of the biography of Donald Dewar. It was called Scotland's Lost Leader. I only went in to buy it, see if I was cited at the end. I was trying to read it, but no, I wasn't. I genuinely wanted to buy a copy. And I I was impressed because when I went in, they said, oh yes, we have 7 copies in the shop. They're in the history section. No, they weren't. They're in the politics section. No, they weren't. They'd actually lost them. So I said, you've lost the lost leader. And I thought on reflection, having been Donald's advisor for a few years, that he would have really enjoyed that, the fact that they'd lost him. He had a very wry sense of humour. But why I mention that is, on the 25th anniversary of Scottish Federation of Housing Association, he spent the morning dealing with a horrible set of press issues round about the introduction of same-sex marriage, which was really horrible press to deal with, and also a sort of disastrous performance in the school education system. He came back to Meridian Court in Glasgow because he was working out that at lunchtime. He said, I don't know why I do this job. He was really down from just being battered. And I said, well, you'll have to think about that later. At 2 o'clock, you've got to go along to Mitchell Library and give a talk to the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. He gave a brilliant talk because he was a Member of Parliament from Drumchapel. He'd seen how Housing Association, supported by Scottish Homes, I'll just point out, had actually transformed much of Drumchapel as a model for other places. And in his lecture, and I remember it well, he talked about the wider benefits for the community and not just the very good social housing that was being provided and replacing what had been a really massively expensive failure. We went back to the office and I said to him, well, how do you feel about what you do now? And he said, this is why I do this job. So this is important. Politicians, MSPs know what you do, and I'll come back to this at the very end. This isn't in my talk, by the way. This is just an extra you're getting at the beginning, so don't count it in the timing. They know. What you've got to do is organise these arguments so they get through the filters of the civil service and the parliamentary process and the special advisors. Get it in the heads of special advisors. I was a special advisor for, I advised 3 get to the civil service, get these messages, get them articulated and get them moving, because there's great empathy and sympathy for the position that they have, and in their heart of hearts they know. So give them some numbers and give them a story, a narrative that you can tell to really make the difference. Now, I grew up quite a lot of my life in Glasgow, so I do have eyes in the back of my head, but I can't actually see my slides as there we go. I want to cut to the chase now and get on with this. I'm going to do this in 4 parts, and the first 2 is going to be very quick. It's about the context we're in and why this is particularly important. You have a narrative right now. Secondly, I want to talk about what housing is and does, because you don't get that right. The civil service doesn't get it right, and the government don't get it right in the way they actually frame the governance of housing policy. I'm not going to go into that in depth. We dealt with that in some ways last year. But what I'm going to do is very quickly say why we built it from below. Asked you what you did, identified what you did, and talked about what you might want to do, because that's at least the way we have to start this conversation. And then I want to turn fairly quickly to what the findings actually mean for what individual associations have to do, what SFHA might do, and what I think the Scottish Government should start to do. And by that, I don't mean just when I say government, and I don't just mean the civil servants, and I don't just mean the politicians, but the Parliament. We are in an age where we will only deal with the housing polycrisis, as I talk about it, if we work collaboratively. There's no chance that a single party will be able to make the fundamental reforms. Stick public service reform up there, and the housing bit of that hasn't even been scratched, in my view. Stick reform of taxation up there, stick reform of the land system up there, and you've got 2, 3, 4 issues that we won't change in Scotland until the Parliament starts to behave differently and parties. Burnham's right, you know, it's not just about putting place before politics, but it's about putting people in places before politics in terms of ideologies and actually resolving the crisis we have. So this is really serious now. And I'm really beginning to talk about the context of change that we have, or I'm not talking about it. In the context we have housing emergencies for individuals. We have for the state, for government, a long-standing, not an emergency, a long-standing and unresolved system polycrisis is now worsening. Households can no longer afford homes and builders can no longer afford to build them. And that's where we are now, and that's actually getting significantly worse. The adverse housing outcomes that come from that are influencing not just increasing spending pressures on other programmes, and I'll come back to that, but they're also slowing progress on all the major missions, not just the social mission that is now highlighted by having housing back without a housing cabinet secretary, but this being very centrally in the social mission, as it should be, but it's more than that, but also detracting from emissions and net zero, and I think growth and productivity. It's not all of the productivity agenda, obviously, and housing productivity is only part of the housing agenda. It's because it's one small part of the world that I know a little bit about. That's why I'm emphasising it, but it is important. So we want to know about the connections between housing actions, housing outcomes, wider spending needs, and national performance. And we don't understand the connections. We haven't articulated what we do know, and they're, as a researcher, I'd always say, they're under-researched. In terms of change, I do think there was quite a bit of progress in some of the aspects of housing policy in Scotland between 24 and 26. Some, I think, pretty desperately stupid measures on the rental sector were abandoned or revised through collaborative discussion in the Parliament. But also, I think that having a Cabinet Secretary, the beginnings of a discussion at the Economic Infrastructure Review and Housing mattered. And that is much less evident now than it was 6 months ago. And I think that that's a backward step, at least in discussion in politics. I'm leaving the civil service out of that chastisement, if you like. But I think that we're in a context where the fiscal difficulties of the Parliament are deepening, the fiscal difficulties of the UK government are deepening. The American debt crisis is not even featured in our discussions yet for the next year. In other words, the fiscal position is going to be much worse a year from now than is actually anticipated. So don't expect pouring lots of money into the existing silos of provision are going to address the polycrisis. They're not. They're not. So we have to do this differently, and arguing the economic narrative is part of the reason and part of the way of doing this differently. In other words, when we have policy crisis, we have to reframe how we think about something. And I'm constantly amazed about how so many of the concepts and ideas and ways we think about this actually come from the 1960s and the 1980s. They were there when I started looking at this stuff as a student, for God's sake. I mean, and the world has changed, but we still use many of the same definitions. We still classify things the same way in accounts. We still talk about housing in terms of big numbers rather than really what it is and what it does, and I'll come to that. So we need to reframe how we think about housing from thinking about housing expenditure through the government expenditure silo on housing policy and framing. We have to think about how government manages the whole housing system, how it manages the whole housing system. And that includes thinking about when we're dealing in projects, whether you're dealing with it in Fife or whether you're dealing with it in the Borders or Glasgow or wherever, what you're doing is influenced by what the UK government are doing. What you're doing is influenced by what the Scottish Government are doing across various departments. What you're doing is influenced by what local government is doing, by what the Glasgow City region is, or whatever regional collaboration. In other words, I think Mr. Burnham's right. We actually have to think about collecting these ideas together at more local scales. I think in housing, the scales that matter are the regional structure plan area or regional partnership area, if it's well defined, or neighbourhoods. You actually operate at both scales. That's where functionally housing matters, but we govern at neither of these scales in terms of how we deliver housing. And in terms of the complex system, we've centralised more and more back to the Scottish level. This is not unique to Scotland. It happened in Canada and Australia. It happened at the UK level. And what you can say for sure is, given the complexity of the housing system, higher order governments, and I don't mean morally or in efficiency terms, but simply in terms of scale or in terms of jurisdictional power, they're too far away to see the nuances, to create the networks, to shift the way in which things actually happen. So a significant devolution or decentralisation, and I know they're different, of how we do housing policy to more local scales is really important. And within that framing, you then become really important. You become important. And you have a question that you have to address. Are you simply the people that deliver really good social housing according to the traditional agenda? Or are you somehow on wider missions about place change, about neighbourhood change? Are you doing other things? Not paying for public services out of tenants' rents rather than local taxes, which is starting to happen. And we picked this up in here, simply because local governments have been so squeezed. You really have to think about what your roles are and how you evolve. Some of you have, and some of you haven't. So let's get on to that. That was a 1 minute part of my speech, Susan, so I'll cut out some things later on. So in terms of rethinking what housing is and what it does, just very quickly from an economic standpoint, housing is two things. It's activities. You build homes, you create jobs and incomes. You stimulate the market, more people, more housing turnover, buy white goods and so on. It can range, including construction, from 7% to 15% of GDP in a booming city. In the peak years of Edinburgh's housing boom of earlier times, you would have found, if you'd calculated these things, it contributes about 15% of GDP. So multiplier effects, income effects, impacts on economic stability. We know that. The measures of it are quite good. And governments actually do think about that in terms of fiscal policy. We also have to think, and this is where we fail, is that housing, it's the noun. It's fixed capital stock, it's locationally fixed, other than in a world of tents and mobile homes, but I suppose I shouldn't mention mobile homes when I'm talking in Scotland, but it's okay to talk about it in Canada still. In that context, we are talking about how the scale and quality of a home affects the capacity of people to live, of kids to learn, for people to be healthy, for people. That's about creating human capital. We make up for what we do badly by having more and more training programs that don't work. So that if we think about some of these effects on human capital, if we build houses a way out from the city centre in Edinburgh and people are commuting to work, okay, we've lost productivity through increased travel time, but more to the point, you've disconnected the functionality of labour market matching in an urban economic agglomeration. I mean, there are very good technical economic arguments in there, but the way we do housing really significantly affects the functioning of the labour market in the short run, the long term. There's only one or two minor studies of that in Scotland, one of them that was actually done in 1968. So we don't know what actually your economic consequences are. And we know in areas that are expanding. Very often in housing in Scotland, we concentrate in areas of decline. We need to think more about how we invest in housing to facilitate growth. We did in the past. SFHA built 12,000 houses in the northeast of Scotland to give people decent housing because of the boom in employment there. What's happening in the Highlands just now with infrastructure change? What's happening in places that are obviously growing? What's happening in the whole of the triangle? Well, Dundee's slightly out of it. That triangle that stretches over from Dundee over towards Falkirk to south of Edinburgh, where there's been a huge growth in Scottish population, huge growth in Scottish economic activity, and not much growth in the provision of affordable housing. Because we do have to deal with the problems of disadvantage in the declining economy, but we don't think for the growing economy. So, on these issues, we know that there are important issues in productivity and growth, and I could actually talk about this for several years. About I'm going to get the grief from Susan just in a minute. So I've already done this bit about rethinking what housing is and what housing does. So don't tell me we understand housing in Scotland by saying we've upped starts by 5%. Starts of where, for whom, for what? What role are they playing? Don't tell me that local housing system analysis, of which I was one of the original creators, is giving you all the numbers you need. No, it isn't. We've got to know what's being produced where and what its economic, social and environmental consequences are, and how we relate to the national performance framework. We haven't done that. By the way, I was greatly encouraged by one publication of the Scottish Government this week, and that was the Serving Scotland document. It actually articulates a framework of thinking across. It's not silos, it's about systems, it's about prevention rather than simply dealing with things ex post. That document actually gave me a bit of hope. Although Programme for Government basically puts nothing new on the table, there at least, if government listened to the civil service, which I think they should, there is, I think, a fairly clear statement by the civil service that this is a modern way of thinking about things. And for the first time in 10 years, I had some positive hope that the civil service will do the right thing. I don't mean, I'm not down in the civil service, but it was articulating a clear case about how to do this differently. But that's for another time, maybe in about 5 years. But I think we've done that. I'm not going to go through these things other than say that this is what exists inside my head. And the triangle at the bottom is really where I'm emphasising. It's the choices that we make as individuals in a society in terms of the houses we have, the qualities they have, the prices they have, the locational accessibility that really matter in shaping development. Now, in terms of what you do, in terms of the economy, you impact all these things: direct economic activity, capital investment, you have supply chain effects, you have place-based economic development, and your role is completely underrated in that regard. I can't believe how little attention EDAS, and I'm sorry if anyone from EDAS is here and you feel insulted by that, I can't believe how little attention you played to the role of particularly community-oriented housing associations in local economic development in Scotland. And the same goes for the Community Wealth Programme, which I think is extraordinary. You're the biggest presence in community wealth building in the country, but you feature very little in the discussion of whatever. I think that's shocking policy making, and it shows a narrow-mindedness that got caught up in silos, and that needs to be dealt with, and you have to deal with that. I don't have to deal with that. You have to deal with that. And all these other things about labour market, household stability, financial security, they all matter in a well-functioning economy and a productive economy. You contribute to them. We could have done this, or some people try to do this, by macroeconomic, econometric. I do that stuff sometimes from time to time, but there's a museum for witchcraft just up the street, and I think that for today's audience that's not entirely appropriate. It is valuable work, but We don't have the data in Scotland. We haven't constructed the models. You can do models of impact, and the City of Toronto has just recently done one that's brilliant, that shows how housing basically saves billions of dollars on the health service if you do housing properly. We know that, but we don't measure it, we don't bother, we just leave it sat in the housing health budget, which is probably inadequate as is, but we don't identify these effects. So when you're trying to, there is one study of the productivity effects of housing and homelessness, and that was by Stephen Boyle, not the auditor, but the former RBS economist, that showed that homelessness actually reduces productivity. And that's the one convincing econometric study that there is in Scotland in the last 30 years about housing and productivity effects. I haven't done any because it's much easier to get research money in Canada and Australia because they're actually interested in this question. But what we did do in this study was bottom-up, association-based. We went out and interviewed, we did a survey. Our first major finding, by the way, is as a sector, you don't like filling in surveys. So after much arm twisting by Andrew, who really did a great job and supported by Ellie, we got a fairly reasonable 30% response that was reasonably representative. And I'm going to tell you what you said, because that's what is really important here. We did follow up by talking to about 20 senior staff, and we explored the literature and talked in more detail about what you do with about a dozen associations. So that's the basis of what follows. In terms of that framework, in terms of what you think is important, you'll find that a very significant proportion of associations feel that you don't articulate your economic narrative very effectively, and we would agree. That would be a major point of agreement. I'm sorry, I'm just going to throw that framework away. But we're seeing there that you agree that it's important to do it, but when you come to your own, this is associations, not SFHA, your strategic decision taking, not very many of you use any of the economic data that you have. So you know this is important, but you don't actually deliver the inputs into your own decision taking. That's where you have to change. Before we pushing government to change, you have to change in terms of the arguments that you make. In terms of the kind of effects that you consider, down the left-hand side, there are issues that come out of just core delivery of good social housing. There's affordability. By the way, that has a big effect on consumption and stability of consumption in local economies that never get or rarely gets measured. There's the public service savings that you recognise. You know you make a contribution to regeneration, but you have no idea the extent or scale or value, apart from the associations that do the social value estimates. And they're all showing estimates of between 4 and 10. These are huge returns. I don't know if you as a sector know what the overall figure is, but you don't include the economic effects in there, so that if you're looking at general benefit and not just social returns, that return on social investment would be higher. These are really important figures to get out there and convince the Scottish government economists to take them really seriously and work at, if they need improved, work at improving them. We know that obviously you consider local supply chains and important. We also then get to the question of you move beyond your core social function to actually doing work through subsidiaries, and this is about the wider impact. And they relate to extending the housing role, doing factoring, doing low-cost home ownership, doing mid-market rent. Mid-market rent is a really critical economic functioning at the present time, and will continue to be so as long as entry into home ownership is stalled for people just below middle incomes. You're having a huge effect in growing labour markets of easing some of the pressure by doing that. That's not recognised to any significant extent in policy making. But there's also a whole range of other issues in relation to energy and energy supply, and the singular failure to use associations as not just people who embed green technologies and designs in their homes, but actually as vehicles to promote energy descent, I think is a huge missed opportunity in Scottish communities, particularly the rural communities. So that's all really important. And again, you know about it, but do you measure your contribution? 7% of you, 7% of you say, yeah, we do this regularly. Remember, most of you want an economic narrative for the sector. 27% of you say, no, we're not doing this and we're not thinking of doing it presently. Well, it may be that you have such a well-defined, narrow, estimated view of what you're doing in a core social housing function, that's fine. But if you're doing anything outside of that, if you have any legitimate voice in this argument, you need to get going on that. You're not considering it now, but you might do it in the future. Well, for those of you who responded in that category, I suspect you just leave now and go home and do it. It'd be really useful. But 57%, a bit iffy. Now that comes from the culture and development of your sector, which I've seen over the last 50 years. And taking your economic role seriously has never been important. But on the other hand, I think that, hey, big spenders, when you look at the numbers, that's a very significant overall expenditure. And actually, in terms of this sector, although you're only about a fifth of the housing output, you're actually bigger than fisheries and agriculture. And just think how people think how important they are in the Scottish economy and get lots of press and lots of attention to these issues. You as a sector are actually, just in these crude numbers, are actually bigger. But above all, on that, your expenditure is concentrated in the poorest places. Poorest places. In terms of these concentrated effects, I'm just going to go through this really quickly. You do lots spending on local supply chains. Even the big nationals in here make a big attempt to use local supply chains. That's why you're so important in local economic development. And the fact that you're not at the policy tables discussing local economic development in most of Scotland's local economic partnerships, and certainly not in the regional economic partnerships, again, it's a huge failure of perception and governance. I'm not going to go, you know what these things are on the right-hand side. But if you just stick to labour market effects, there's key worker attraction. About 20% of you think this is really important. In fact, 2/3 of you think it's really important. But how are you being empowered to do that? You're not. You manage to do it. You're not being empowered to do it. That's important. Do you increase workforce participation to a significant extent in the poorest places? So, a minority of associates take the strategic interest in their economic, a minority in the strategic economic narrative. We know that measurement can be greatly strengthened and a credible economic narrative constructed. For the majority, you can't just wish it into existence. You can't have people like me come along and say, hey, you're important, you've got a great economic story to tell. You have to do it, and you have to do more work, and actually research and government has to do more. That's not for the likes of me. I'm an old guy. I don't do all these really big projects anymore. Not for the amounts of money that there are in Scottish Government. That's why I wear a yellow jacket nowadays. It requires for you in associations who don't do this or don't do it very well a minor effect. What we were impressed by, or what Andrew was impressed by because he did most of the work, was going through your documents. You, through your business cases, your reports to regulators, other things you do to funders, you've got most of the information there. You just don't make that 5% extra effort to translate it into the start of your economic story. And you really should do it. I'd suggest the benefit-cost ratio would be pretty high in that regard. In terms of urgent actions, after you all saying SFHA should have a story, how effectively does association currently articulate their economic contribution, as you see from that slide, or as you can't see from that slide, but I can tell you what's on it. By and large, you don't think they do it particularly effectively, so that can improve significantly. In terms of working in partnerships, you know you make a big contribution in relation to public health on all these range of issues. Go back to my earlier point about how much we actually influence and formally be involved in these partnerships. You're doing it a lot, particularly at neighbourhood scales. That's just not reflected in your influence in these decisions, and you need to actually significantly change that. When I ask what's holding you back, you give me a long list about government, well, inflation and rising costs. You can't really blame on the Scottish Government. I mean, it's a global phenomenon, and a lot of these other issues are directly impacted by Scottish Government and local government policy. Do policy makers understand what you're saying? You don't believe it. Look at the chart on the right. You're saying that there's only a small, 17% or something, believed that it was moderately understood. The rest, in other words, Scottish Government doesn't get what you do in this regard, and I think that's true. And I think that shows how much has regressed in Scottish Homes for actually dealing with this. On the new Homes Agency, and sorry I've gone on so long, Susan, and I'll stop. In the new agency, I'm kind of slightly horrified. I've actually been advising the Government of Canada on Build Canada Homes. We're having this discussion in Scotland. It's all about the supply side and it's all about faster planning. No, it's not. The faster planning thing is only one side on the supply side. If you're setting up an agency, it's going to change things. It's about demand, it's about distribution of income as much as it is about supply. And supply is about gaps in infrastructure, shortages of labour, shortages of materials. So that the whole framing of the discussion, to me, has partly missed the point. But within it, I see lots of discussion about what the private sector are going to do differently. Scottish Homes, when it existed, its central concern was improving the effectiveness of the non-profit sector, and it did. And it spread its role to rural areas, to towns. It got out of Glasgow and supported a whole range of different things. You've got to make that new agency. By the way, I've not had a single person in Scotland ask me about what the new agency might do. Given us 10 years on the board, I actually do have some ideas, and I'm going to write them down in the paper next week now that I've finished this project for Susan. But you've got to get your voice at the core of the governance arrangements that there are. In terms of More Homes Scotland, you've got to be involved in that. You should have a strategic role, you should have a board role, you should have people in a sense involved at, it should operate primarily at the regional scale. That's where when Scottish Homes worked effectively. It shouldn't be civil servants who've been in Victoria Quay. They know about transmitting policy and they don't know about these complex, complicated chains that there are on the ground, so you don't get delivery. So get people into that agency that know about delivery, give its weight of power to that regional scale, and at these local and regional scales, set up basically regional supply councils that are you and the private sector, and discuss these issues, and make this set of arguments sing. You can make them sing, we can do much better, and the Scottish Government, at the end of the day, have a range of things they can do. I'm optimistic if they're serious about serving Scotland as the document. I think it was a good document that came out last week. Good in the sense that Programme for Government was bad. I think that you can make a real difference here. But you've got to work at it, but do it now. This not just the place for storytelling, this is the time for storytelling. For all of you that contributed, and Susan, I'm sorry I talked too long, I've had a career where people commission me to talk about complex system arguments and say, you've got 5 minutes to do it. I've developed a thick skin where I generally speak for somewhat longer than I've been invited to, and I apologise. I genuinely do apologise for that, but if you want to know what we find out and what you might do about it, and I do give you my opinion, I'm not a one-handed, well, Harold Wilson, when he was asked what sort of economist he wanted to advise him, he said, I want a one-handed economist as opposed to the Keynesian or a monetarist. People said, what do you mean? He said, I had economic advisors say, on the one hand, we should do this, and on the other. So I appreciate all the arguments and the balance of the arguments, but at the end of the day, you've got to say what you think is right. And I think you make a huge contribution. The encouraging thing for you, I've just been doing work for the Government of Canada looking at 7 non-profit systems. I haven't introduced that into discussion today, or you'd be here all week. But that's about how you scale up and double the size of their association sector in 5 years. Mr. Carney is a central banker who has amazing social values. So they're really committed to doing this. But looking across these European sectors and Australia, you actually, believe it or not, articulate the wider impacts better than anyone apart from the Danes. You're just not getting the credit for it. You're just not. You're crossing the ball, nobody's putting it in the net. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. That was a brilliant whistle-stop tour, and I'll just let you know that I've worked with you long enough, Duncan, to know now that I tell you 20 minutes and you're going to take 40. But that's classic Duncan. I didn't want to stop you.
You know that.
Let's change this. Over to Richard. Welcome.
Thank you, Duncan. That was really excellent. And thank you also to Andrew for what has been, I think, an excellent and thought-provoking piece of work. I also want to thank the SFHA members who contributed to the research, the members who completed the survey, and the organisations and individuals who took part in the group discussions and the one-to-one interviews. I think the richness of the report comes from the experience and evidence that you all shared. And there is a great deal in that report, and Duncan has taken through a lot of its key findings, so I definitely don't want to repeat his presentation. Instead, what I want to do is respond to the challenge that he's set us, and how we use this evidence to change the way that housing is understood, how we broaden the case for investment, and how we help shape the government's agenda rather than simply responding to it. And we begin from a position of enormous housing need in Scotland. Scotland has about 633,000 social homes, and housing associations and cooperatives provide just under half of those. But demand continually and substantially exceeds supply. And the clearest evidence of that failure is the number of households that are currently living in temporary accommodation, now at its highest level. And too many families, too many children are spending far too long without the security of a permanent home and all the benefits that brings. Last year, independent research commissioned by SFHA, Shelter and CIH Scotland found that Scotland needs 78,465 social and affordable homes over the course of this 5 years of the Scottish Parliament, and that's about 15,700 homes a year. And that's if we're really serious about ending or beginning to end the housing emergency, or polycrisis as you call it, Duncan, to end the housing emergency, or polycrisis as you call it, Duncan. And the Scottish Government has committed to supporting the delivery of 36,000 affordable homes by the end of this decade, and they've committed 4.9 billion of investment, including 4.1 billion of that in public funding, and the wider commitment of 110,000 affordable homes by 2032. And we do welcome these commitments, and we were pleased to see them reiterated in the programme for government on Tuesday. But we have to be really honest about the scale of the gap. We commissioned earlier work this summer from the Fraser Allender Institute, and their analysis, which was just published last month, suggested that based on recent trends, only around 75,000 of those 110,000 homes will be completed by 2032, approximately 35,000 short of that target. So reaching the government's ambitions will require not only sustained investment, but action across the whole delivery system: planning, land, infrastructure, construction, capacity, skills, and development viability. So the next 5 years will be crucial. But I also believe they give us a really significant opportunity to position housing differently, not as a policy area that's competing against health, economic development, education, poverty reduction, but actually as something that enables progress across all those areas. The programme for government on Tuesday committed public services to be to a decisive shift towards prevention and early intervention. And we welcome that. But we have also heard it before. And so if that commitment is to change to outcomes rather than remain an aspiration, housing must be part of how prevention is designed, funded, and delivered. That is absolutely critical. And reorganisation may sometimes be necessary, and structural change, as we're hearing about in terms of NHS boards and other things, are important to help with that process. But it will not on its own deliver the outcomes or the savings that government needs. Lasting reform comes from changing systems, investing earlier, preventing crisis, and aligning services around people and places. Investment in housing is the key that unlocks meaningful public service reform, preventing crisis, improving people's lives, and helping the government to deliver its own aspirations and ambitions for Scotland. We already know that homelessness is a public service reform issue. Preventing someone from losing their home is better for that person and their family, and it avoids the far greater human and financial cost that follow when crisis is allowed to develop. And the 50 million Homelessness Prevention Fund and the commitment to end unsafe and harmful temporary accommodation for children are important in that programme for government. And we absolutely want to work with government to ensure that this investment actually prevents homelessness in practice and connects people quickly to the settled homes that they need. But affordable and social housing can do so much more. A safe, warm and affordable home is an upstream public health intervention. It can improve physical and mental health, help people live independently, reduce pressure on health and social care, give children greater stability in education, and provide the foundation from which people can work and participate in their communities. We should be careful not to claim that every avoided cost becomes an immediate cash saving. Often it does not. But better housing unquestionably changes demand, improves outcomes, and allows scarce public resources to be used more effectively. And that is precisely what meaningful reform should seek to achieve. The same is true of the economy. Investment in housing strengthens Scotland's economy by creating jobs, supporting local supply chains, and enabling people and businesses to thrive. I think one of the most important insights in today's report is the economic contribution of housing associations has construction, but it certainly does not end there. An affordable home allows a nurse, a care worker, or a teacher to live near to the community that they serve. It helps employers recruit and retain staff. In rural and island communities in particular, the availability of housing can determine whether essential services and local businesses actually remain viable. A secure tenancy gives a household greater stability, more control over its income. Investing in existing homes lowers energy costs, supports skilled employment, and strengthens local supply chains. Tenancy sustainment can help prevent homelessness, while adaptations and supported housing and tech can help people live independently and reduce pressure elsewhere in the public system. I was encouraged actually in the programme for government, I don't think it was all bad, Duncan, but and they did identify housing as a strategic focus for their new major projects office. And that is an important recognition of housing's economic role. We now need to ensure that that office works with the sector to remove the barriers holding back investment and delivery, not only on individual developments, but across the whole housing system. And I think it is really important to remember that our housing associations are anchor institutions. They are rooted in their communities, often investing over decades where others cannot or will not. And they do support regeneration, community facilities, commercial workspaces, apprenticeships, employability, local procurement, welfare advice, energy investment, and community wealth building. That is why housing should be treated as infrastructure, not only physical infrastructure, but social and economic infrastructure, like we do with transport, energy, and digital connectivity. Housing determines whether people, places, and economies can function. And that brings us directly back to the research that Duncan and Andrew have presented today. And the report gives a compelling picture of the breadth of the contribution that housing associations make and the routes through which it is delivered. It shows that they are substantial economic organisations. Duncan highlighted the figures, 2.2 or nearly 2.3 billion in turnover, significant capital investment. Duncan also in his report talks about those 10 connected areas of economic contribution: direct economic activity, capital investment, supply chain effects, place-based developments, skills, labour participation. There's 10. That is a much broader and more persuasive story than simply talking about the number of homes we build or the number of people we employ, although those figures are important too. And I absolutely agree with Duncan's challenge that we need to tell this story more confidently. It is something that I noticed when I came into this role almost a year ago. Within the sector, I think we understand deeply the difference a safe, warm and affordable home makes to people's lives. But we have not always made that case beyond the sector, and we have not always had the consistent evidence needed to support it. And again, the report reinforces that point. 80% of the respondents to the survey said articulating the sector's economic contribution was very or extremely important. Yet most do not measure that contribution consistently. And many believe that policymakers understand it only slightly or not at all. And I think for us at SFHA, we are committed to building this narrative and strengthening this evidence base and demonstrating the sector's potential to further drive Scotland's economy. But evidence is only useful if it changes decisions. Our asks of government is not simply for larger housing budget, although we do recognise that sustained and adequate investment over time is absolutely essential. It's for housing to be embedded in the design of economic policy and public service reform right from the beginning. And we do welcome, again, there's recent references to this in the programme for government, and there is some good language there. However, that recognition needs to turn into delivery. And housing associations should not be invited into the room after the agenda has been written. As community anchors, investors, employers, and delivery partners, we should help shape that agenda. That means treating housing investment as part of the answer to child poverty, to economic growth, to health inequalities, to workforce pressures, to net zero and sustainable public services. It means looking beyond the cost of a home and asking what that home makes possible for the individual who lives there, for the community around it, and for Scotland as a whole. The title of this report is The Story So Far. And that is exactly right. Today gives us a much stronger account of the contribution that housing associations already make. Our responsibility now is to build that evidence, to broaden the coalition and turn that story into influence. Housing is not a cost to be managed after every other priority has been decided. It is an investment that helps Scotland deliver those priorities: reducing poverty, improving health, supporting employment, strengthening our communities and growing our economies. And that is the case that we will make with confidence and with evidence and with the sector's voice. So thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Can I ask Bryony and Nile to join us on the stage? So while they're taking the seats, I will just say we're going to have now initial reflections from Bryony. Bryony's Home Group's Director for Scotland. She joined in 2024 from Maryhill Housing Association Glasgow, where she was Chief Executive for 7 years. Before this, Bryony worked for Islington Council in London, where she started out as a graduate trainee, working in various roles. One of those roles was Head of Housing, Partnerships and Communities. And now, who will follow Bryony is from the Eildon Group in the Scottish Borders. He became Chief Executive in 2020. A range of housing, care and support services.
and particularly I spent this morning, because that's who it said, looking at all the strategies of the enterprise agencies. And South of Scotland Enterprise absolutely gets housing as critical to what they're doing, and they've got people on their board who get housing and understand that. The Highlands Enterprise Agency identifies housing as the biggest barrier to economic growth, but there is no one on their board who understands how to actually make that happen. And Scottish Enterprise, apparently housing isn't a critical issue in the Central Belt. So for me, there's different funding will be standard and ESG reporting, and as Duncan said, the problem is that doesn't look at economic benefits, but we have all got the data. So is there an opportunity to, or an ask for our federations to work together on that standard so that we can all paint that picture and tell that story? And I think where we are at the moment with Scotland and England, I think we've got an opportunity to kind of play the two off against each other, really. You've got Scottish Government directly comparing their investment in housing to Andy Burnham's record in Manchester. So I think in order to influence what we're doing in Scotland, we have...
I've certainly been in housing a long time. Issues is we try to present an entirely clear and unified story. And I think the story of our sector is one of difference and diversity, and I think we need to lean into that. It's the place-based thing. It's the fact that we do things differently in different parts of the country, because that's what the need is, and that's what our missions are. And it wouldn't make sense for me to do exactly the same in the Borders as the organisation in Glasgow where I sit on board. They're entirely different challenges, and that diversity and place positioning is, and as we're successful, and could be modernised, reintroduced, adapted and applied in different parts of Scotland with the right will, with the right knowledge, building on the knowledge of the past, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and then leaning into the low energy, easy response stuff, which is some kind of deposit guarantee scheme to enable people to access home ownership. There's better ways of using our knowledge, our collective knowledge and our influence than just simply leaning into those patently obvious choices that are not only not effective, but often counterproductive.
Fantastic. You can see why I chose them in that wonderfully forthright reflections. I just want to pick up, and I'm going to put Craig Stewart on the spot here because I can see him rolling his eyes. Sorry, Craig. But Bryony gave a challenge to Highlands and Islands Enterprise there, and Grampian, I think, hasn't had a voice on the panel, and I'm really aware that we've been to the south of Scotland, so I think we should go further up the country first. So if you want to give us equally forthright reflections, that would be wonderful.
It's a post on LinkedIn. I am very conscious about the impact of the economy on the environment and the well-being of citizens in the North East in particular in the sector. And there are different challenges across the sector, and we all respond in a way that's appropriate in the sector. So it's going to be limited for some RSLs because of historic reasons of past borrowing, the amount of debt they have. So there's going to be a finite capacity for us to continue to do everything we want to do. Which might result in debt write-off, or is the economy too short that is never going to happen? But in terms of resource transfer, we've seen what's happened where that happened before. It would be a programme, as Nile says, it wouldn't apply to all parts of Scotland, but where it's really needed, could that be a thing?
Right, hold that thought, because if we go back to Duncan, we'll lose our last few minutes. We will go back to Duncan in a minute. Tom, I can see you sitting there hiding away. Tom from Fife, can you give us a few reflections?
Okay, thanks. I got a lot of notes there as well. First of all, again, I should recognise Craig's thanks. This is a really appreciated piece of work, a vital piece of work. Slightly depressed though, sad about it, because Duncan has been warning us of this stuff and their ability to make a good argument. At least to me personally, for more than a decade. He sat in my commission in 2014 and wrote the same things, and we've not moved on. Let's assume for a moment magic wand and the sector gets its argument act together. What's going to move the dial now, given the dark fiscal climate that we're looking into.
Okay, panel, over to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think the fiscal position of the UK and OECD countries generally will deteriorate because of difficulties in bond markets round about financing 40 trillion of US debt. It's not the sort of local tax arrangements in Scotland that are the really important thing for next year and the year after. So that don't look for more money to, at least from that dimension, to solve the issue. Richard, I thought your summary was great, by the way. I do think, I didn't suggest that programme for government was all bad. I just suggested it wasn't enough to actually make the kind of progress that government have said they would make. So we do need to think about what is radically different. So in terms of debt write-off, I've still got copies of the letters between First Minister of Scotland, Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown about the Glasgow stock transfer write-off, because I was the emissary that flitted between London and Edinburgh when that occurred. And they were very, Britain was in fiscal surplus. There was a public debt write-off programme. There isn't going to be. So what then might happen in Scotland? I actually do think that if you're serious about public sector reform, the success, and I view it as a success of the Glasgow transfer and the way Wheatley have played a powerful role, not just in Glasgow, but across Scotland, you could really think about having a stock transfer programme in Scotland. There would be a significant number of authorities that would have positive values in their stock. You need to estimate that. You'd also need to decide about whether or not, if you had a stock transfer programme, whether or not these surpluses might be redistributed to fund those that might be in deficit. Nobody's talked about that. Whenever I've talked about it, I don't even talk about a stock transfer because my yellow jacket would get ruined fairly quickly. But I do think it's going forward, if we're talking about radical reform, then I do think that Scottish Government should be thinking about that, because they're going to be in a very deep hole on finances pretty quickly.
Richard, do you want to do a last reflection?
Okay, I'll just be very quick. I was going to respond to Tom's point. I think the fiscal situation isn't great. 5 billion, I think, is what government's looking to make a saving for by the end of the decade. But I think that becomes our opportunity to really help us tell this story better. Because actually, at the very heart of everything, all the things that we've talked about, and you see it in Duncan's report and what we've been talking about, is actually housing is critical to some of those system changes. And actually, it's about changing the narrative from, oh, that's a subsidy, that's a cost, and this is actually, it's the investment. And the investment that will actually help them create those efficiencies in systems, help them improve their outcomes. I mean, they do have aspirations, and you talked about the national performance framework, and I think that's a really good place to look and how housing interacts with that and the difference it can make. So I think, yes, the fiscal situation is pretty dire, but I think it gives us an opportunity to really tell that story and put us in a position to make sure that we are part of the solution for government so that we see greater investment and support for housing associations. There's lots of other stuff too, but we're really short on time.
I don't think I've got any real final reflection, so I'll hand on in case you do now.
I'd only say, lean into that. I think it seems obvious to me there is no solution. If you look at the most sympathetic public policy issue in terms of public perception, the NHS, there is no solution to the challenges in the NHS without housing investment. And I think that's where the opportunity comes in. If we're really serious about turning that narrative into reality, we have to invest in appropriate housing to take the strain off the National Health Service. That is obviously a jewel in the crown and something that everyone wants to support.
Fantastic. Duncan's got one more word.
I didn't major on the preventative effects. I think they're really important. In fact, in quantity terms, in the short term, they may be greater than the productivity effects. But don't forget the productivity effects as well as the preventative effects. They're not the same thing. They're both economic effects, but they're not the same thing. About the time this project was starting, I was advising one of the major Canadian banks who were commissioning a project largely through the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, which failed to make the full stock transfer that Glasgow did, and is still a public body. And they wanted to model the effects of various different housing investment programs, no investment in modernising the stock, and so on. And to do a simulation, an econometric modelling of what the effects would be. And I would have to say, I wasn't going to be involved in this project. I was asked to advise on it. The cost of doing that was roughly 20 times what you paid for this project. The bank paid for it, and because it was worthwhile, and it showed that basically if you invest in adequate housing stock, you saved a third of the budget in Toronto's hospitals. The modelling was high-skilled, econometric, done by the best modellers in Canada. We've got some good economic modellers, particularly at the University of Strathclyde. They don't have the model to do it, and you'd have to create it. That's my point. It's about, if you want to make these arguments, you have to make them seriously. And what you can see in Canada is the government have shifted their perception of the preventative effects of housing investment. They are important effects. Health is a big one, but education's next, and policing, largely because when you get homelessness rising, you get increases in policing expenditures and not in housing. That's my last one.
I'll keep it over there so it doesn't interfere with this microphone.
Oh, okay.
I'm really sorry. Please accept my apologies that we have not got through more questions. I know lots of you have burning questions in the audience, but sadly the time has come for me to bring the event to a close. There's so much for people to take away from this discussion, no matter what kind of role you work on in the sector. We in the room will continue the discussion over refreshments upstairs. To those of you online, thank you for joining us, and we hope you found the session useful and take forward the learning into your roles. To access the documents, there is a 5-page summary, which is the short read. There is a really detailed 100-page research read, which goes into all the survey work as well as all the background reading and things, but it will really help you make your case. Use the QR code on the screen to either access the summary, and the second one is to give us feedback on the event. Please don't say Susan missed all the questions. I really know that already. I'm sorry. Please remember the David Hume Institute is a charity, and we can only manage to do events that are free and open to all as a result of donations. And so please do get in touch if you've enjoyed this discussion and this research and you want to work with us, because we will be interested to have those conversations. We'd like to thank everyone who has been involved in the research for all the time that you've given up to make this possible. That collective effort we really do appreciate. You can only tell this story by working together. And thank you to SFHA for sponsoring the work. Also a significant amount of pro bono work that has gone in to make this happen. So we are extremely grateful to everyone. And last but not least, I'd finally like to give thanks to our speakers and the audience and the staff at the Storytelling Centre. Please do use this research. It's no good if it sits on a shelf. I want to see it used, and I will be coming to you. I can see people nodding because you know I keep my word to check that you are using it. Thank you very much, everybody. Please do enjoy the rest of your day.